Welcome to All Grit, No Quit, the show where we dive deep into comeback stories, resilience, and the fight to push through when the odds are stacked against you. Each episode, we sit down with the warriors from all walks of life who have faced the fire and came out stronger. You ready? Let's dive in.
Welcome back to All Grit, No Quit, the show where we break down mindsets, habits, and hidden edges that fuel performance when the pressure's at its highest. I'm your host, Tyson Lawrence, and today I'm excited for our guest. We're diving into a side of competition most people either fear or underestimate, which is trash talk. So, like I mentioned, our guest, Rafi Kohan here, he wrote my book of the summer, the author of Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals with your mouth. Got it right here. We'll be giving out a few of them. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But he's dug into the history, the psychology, and strategy behind the words that we can win and lose a game before the scoreboard ever changes. From locker rooms to boardrooms, Trash Talk reveals what really happens when grit meets gamesmanship. You're going to love this one. Welcome to the show, Rafi.
Awesome to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. I know we talked a little bit before, and I just love your book, and I thank you for coming on to talk about this. It's something fascinating that I grew up with, and I've kind of always done personally, and then now taken into my professional life. So to kind of meld the two together was really interesting to me. So let's just jump into a little bit of your background. Give us a snapshot of your journey. How did you, where did you start in your early career? How did you become a journalist? That type of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was always sort of interested in writing, and my early jobs were like sort of in and around media in one form or another. I worked for 5 years at GQ magazine, both first on the advertising side, then on the editorial side as a researcher and reporter. And then I was an editor at the New York Observer, and I worked at the Atlantic magazine as helping run their creative marketing studio, Rethink, for about 5.5 years. And in between there, I also wrote a couple of books along the way. My first one, which came out, like 8 years ago now. It's crazy. It's crazy. That's 2025. It was about sports stadiums. It's called The Arena Inside the Tailgating, Ticket Scalping, Mascot Racing, Dubiously Funded and Possibly Haunted Monuments of American Sport. As you can tell, I like the long subtitles. And then my most recent one, Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage. It's like, I think what's interesting about a question like this, right, is not just in terms of what got me into writing, but also sort of like what got me to these topics specifically, right? And I think that's how you're asking it. And, for me, writing, I've never really been, like a beat reporter or even necessarily like an investigative journalist. I'm not necessarily like the first one on the scene. But at the same time, I like to sort of find things that maybe have been overlooked, or look at things in a new way, and look at the crime scene after the forensics crew has gone through and see, are there any clues we've missed here? Like what story is left to tell? And from my perspective, sports stadiums are kind of like that, in the sense that like they're these huge, like civic monuments. They're essentially like the biggest constructions of present day American civilization. It's where we invest our money. It's where we invest our time, our emotion, all these things. And yet we never really bothered to like stop and think about like, well, what do these places really mean? When you sort of slice them up, like what are the different subcultures and shadow worlds that exist in and around the stadium that help, give them life, help bring them to life. And I think by looking at that, we can sort of understand ourselves better as a culture, as a society. And then in the terms of Trash Talk, it feels really different, right, than a book about stadiums. But to me, it was similar, because what I wanted to get at is that Trash Talk is this thing that's kind of ubiquitous, right? It is ubiquitous. Everyone knows what Trash Talk is, or at least they think they know what Trash Talk is. But we kind of misunderstand it. It's never really been given the credence that, I argue it deserves, because we think about it as this kind of like modern invention that largely emerged out of, more recent cultural inventions like hip hop and playground basketball and whatever. but not actually understanding that it ties back into basically every form of verbal gamesmanship that has ever existed. That it cuts across time, culture, and geography. That basically people have been talking shit since the beginning of time, if not the beginning of language. It's nothing new, and so giving it that kind of credence to take it seriously in order to understand what's really happening here, so we can understand the games we're really playing with each other. Because I think when we don't do that, when we fail to do that, we kind of set ourselves up to fail, because then we don't understand the challenges that are being presented, and we are not given the opportunities to actually understand ourselves on a deeper level in terms of like, what does it take for me to be great? How can I get to my best? How can I build resilience in a situation? These are the things that Trash Talk gives us sort of an opportunity to talk about, because on the most basic level, Trash Talk is a psychological raising of the stakes, right? It's a presentation of a challenge. It puts more pressure on your performance and more pressure on mine. And the follow-up question is, can you handle it? And, the answer to that question could be different from one person to the next, right? It's all about, demonstrating mental toughness in one form or another, right? Understanding what the right thing for you to do is in a given time, in a given place. What's the right decision? What's the right course of action for you? Not getting distracted, not getting overly emotional, all these kinds of things. So I find it to be both sort of universal and timeless, but also incredibly timely, because I feel like we're at a time when we kind of need to be talking about these things more so than ever, because we're living in a world where people don't necessarily take on challenges, right? Or don't necessarily understand how to deal with stress, how to build resilience, how to tell themselves positive stories through adversity. So it was one of those things that I didn't necessarily know all that going into it either. I was just kind of like, I'd love to learn some great Gary Payton stories,
Right.
But the more time you spend with it, the more I realized like how deep it actually went. That this really is this deeply ingrained human behavioral phenomenon. It goes back to the Bible, and it's something that's been with us forever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We got a lot to unpack there. You hit on a lot of things, but what you really hit on too, what it came together for me was the role that it plays in grit and mental toughness and things like that. I think people overlook that part of it. And when I came across your book, I'll tell a quick story here. I told you offline, but I was in Cabo with my family on vacation, and I was reading something real boring that I'm a reader. I grew up in the whole, summer book reading programs. You get a free pizza if you order, you read enough books, that type of thing. And so I have this, I love to read books. And when I don't get to do it very often. So when I go on vacation, I always choose one or two books that are like, okay, I'm going to grind through these in a short period of time. And I was playing pickleball with my girls, and the trash talk came out of me. They'd never seen it before, and they were kind of like, and when we went back to the villa afterwards, I felt kind of bad about it. I was like, holy cow, where did that come from? Why am I trash talking my wife and two daughters while we're playing pickleball? And then your book like came and landed on my lap as I was, a friend of mine was reading it, and I immediately scrapped the playbook, equity playbook that I was reading that was real boring, and grabbed your book and dove in it, and it became like a self-help book almost. I felt so much better after reading it. But it was one of the things I liked interesting about it was the history of it, the history of trash talk, and how you dove into early on in the book about this has been going on for centuries, forever, poems and literature and stuff like that. Talk a little bit more about that. How did you find your way there, and then start realizing that trash talk's been going on for a long, long time?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of knew from the get-go that there were going to be examples from antiquity, and in biblical times there was examples of trash talk. So I always knew
David
that,
and Goliath, like that's the most
exactly, David and Goliath. I will strike you down and cut off your head. Right.
Right.
That is maybe the most effective trash talk ever, or
Right.
one of the top examples. Right.
Right.
Literally a David and Goliath story. And so I always knew that it was going to go back in time, but I didn't necessarily know kind of like how prevalent it was going to be across cultures throughout time, right? The fact that it was something that has been present almost everywhere in one form or another, right? I didn't know that there was a whole tradition of Greek invective poets that like talk shit reverse to each other, right?
Which is the early battle rapping, right?
Basically, yeah, exactly. Or or that politicians in Roman times that publicly talking shit and putting down their opponents and all that was like a big part of like what their public presentation was and how they gained followers and this kind of thing. And even in like you think about games at the Coliseum or outside of the of horse racing, that they would have parties where they were fans. They were literally called partisans, and that they would like have camps that would talk trash back and forth to each other, right? Or Greenlandic Inuit traditions of like drumming circles where they would heap abuse on one another. It's like you can find examples everywhere, and to me, what the point of it is, and like I can list a whole lot of them. I got a lot of them in the book, and I got a lot more that are not in the book. Just because you gotta draw the line somewhere. But the point for me, the important thing I wanted to underscore is to make the case that this is not something like apparent, that this is not something unusual for humans to do. It's not something deviant. It's not something that's like, oh, you're a bad citizen of humanity if you're doing this kind of thing. It's actually part of who we are. Like, it's literally been selected across evolutionary time, right? Like, if this mode of communication was like dysfunctional on like a deep level, it would have been selected out of our behavioral model at some point.
Long time ago, right?
There's a reason why we keep doing it. I mean, and like that those functions can be negotiated within different contexts, within different cultures, and serve different purposes. But the point is, right, that trash talk as competitive incivility, as some sociologists call it, or just as a kind of like verbal gamesmanship, as a way to test and challenge one another, to negotiate status, to negotiate competition, whatever the case may be. There's a reason why we do it. And so once we can establish that, that's when we can have the conversation about like, well, what's really happening here? What's happening beneath the surface? Because I think for a lot of people, they hear trash talk, or they hear the term even trash talking and trash talk, and they're just so turned off by it that they're just like, get this out of my face. This is unsportsmanlike. Right. It's not something I want to engage with. And so that's why for me, that history aspect was so important, was just to ground it in a way to say like, this is part of human nature. This is part of who we are. Because once we can establish that, then we can say, all right, now let's see what else is going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing I found fascinating about it, because I grew up in the '90s, late '80s, '90s, and it kind of was starting to, really manifest itself in the game. Gary Payton from the Northwest, so that was my guy. Watching him do his thing for so long, and then the previous kind of real trash talker that was well known was Muhammad Ali. Before then, I mean, there's a real big kind of gap in there where somebody was so prominent, for trash talking, but it was being cut out of sports. Like, if you tried to do that as a kid, it was like you're a bad, sportsman, all this kind of stuff. And it just kind of never felt right, because it felt more like internal, like nature instincts, to do it. It wasn't thought about for someone like myself. It was something I was doing for me, to bring myself up. What about like, can you define like effective trash talk and, kind of its timing, its accuracy and delivery, kind of the relationship with it? Because Gary Payton was one of those guys, that can kind of do that. And you talk about somebody else in the book that I think also does this amazingly well, and that's Conor McGregor. Can you kind of expand a little bit on that and your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's challenging about defining like effectiveness is you have to sort of first define intent and functionality, because there are so many different functions of trash talk, right? And so the effectiveness and the success of it depends upon like what track are you going down, right? Are you using it from a marketing strategy in order to bring attention to yourself, right? Are you using it from a performance perspective because you want to sort of get yourself into your zone, into your personal, optimal zone of functioning, which is a sports psychology term to define what you're describing, is like those kind of people that need to get themselves hyped up. That's like, this is a mechanism for that. Or are you trying to do it because you're you want to give a mental challenge to someone else. You want to see how someone else is going to respond.
Right.
And you're not necessarily trying to degrade their performance. You may be, but and even if you are, you're still giving them that challenge to respond in the right way, to be mentally tough in return. So it's like all of these paths and more are like different functions of trash talk. So you have to begin by saying like, okay, what is this person trying to do? Right. So like we can give an example, the examples that you gave. Conor McGregor quite clearly was using it, one, to bring attention to himself, right?
Right.
To become, to bring attention to his fights. Within the UFC in particular, as Chael Sonnen put it to me, it's a sport with no architecture, right? It's not like you got to earn your own fights.
Right.
You eat what you kill kind of thing.
Right.
And it's also true for like, especially now UFC's going to, what are they going to, Netflix or wherever they're going, somewhere, or CBS, I forget.
Right. Yeah.
But they're going somewhere. And the point is that now you're just going to like pay, a monthly subscription fee. You're going to get it. But still now and previously before, it's like pay-per-views were are what ruled everything. And you would get like a cut of
Right.
it. And so the bigger draw you were, the more money you're going to make, the bigger fight you're going to get, the next fight, for this fight, for the next fight, et cetera, et cetera. So McGregor understood that in the same way that Muhammad Ali did, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more you talk, the more someone wants to shut you up. That's, one. But also by talking crap, you invest people in the outcome of your fight in the same way that you can raise the stakes in terms of putting pressure on yourself and your opponent. By raising the stakes, you're also making this matter. You're making people care about the outcome in a way, right? To me, there's almost like something existential in this sense, right? It's because you're endowing a confrontation with deeper meaning, like, and that is part of what relates to the stress of it too. Is like, can you handle that? Because if you care more about it, it's like, is that going to feel overwhelming to you? But McGregor also, I think, very much so, did it to sort of get himself up. Right? Did it to get himself into a particular zone, right? Like he knew where he needed to be. He has the self-awareness to know that like, for me to be at my best, I need to feel X amount of like, anxiety, physiological arousal, etc. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, he could also have the side benefit of being like, and I bet some of my opponents maybe can't handle that, right? They might not be able to handle the emotional abuse, the physical, psychological abuse that I'm dumping on them, and they may get overly emotional. They might, veer from their game plan, right? Which is, you're maybe getting outside of your zone, which try not to get too sciencey, but like the zones of optimal function basically is the idea that like everybody has an individualized and personally appropriate zone of optimal functioning, which is like how much anxiety you want to feel in your body to be at your best. Like anxiety is not good or bad, right? It's a question of whether it's functional for me or not. And for some people, different levels can be functional or dysfunctional. And so if you can get someone to a higher level of anxiety than fits within their zone, then their performance can really start to deteriorate quickly. Right? They can even go into fight, flight, or freeze, right? They can have a kind of threat response. But you could also just like make someone mad. You look at the Jose Aldo fight versus Conor McGregor, where he knocks the guy out in 13 seconds, and it's because he got him so riled up over months of abuse, a campaign of abuse, that like the second that bell rings, he's charging right at him, even though that's exactly what he's not supposed to do. The people who did best with McGregor were the ones who could keep their heads and not fall into his traps in like the immediate opening moments of a fight, and then could just fight their own games over time. Right, those are the people, the Khabibs, the Dustin Poiriers. Those are the guys who could do best. And a lot of those last two functions in particular, I think, apply to Gary Payton as well. Right, that it's like that idea of getting himself where he needs to be, creating the engagement, the motivation for himself, but also potentially knocking someone else out of their zone or giving them some kind of distraction, either an emotional distraction or an anxiety response that feels overwhelming, that they don't handle it. They don't handle it in the right way, and they actually do something that's not, optimal within the game plan for the team or even just for themselves. They try to play outside of themselves, right? That's like you're telling me I can't drive on you, I'm going to show you I can. And it's like that's the ego responding. When you let the ego respond instead of focusing on what you're supposed to do, that's when you fall into the trap of a trash talker. So it's like So, so in terms of like efficiency, again, it all kind of depends on how we're defining, the metrics of functionality and the intentions of what we're trying to do. But also, I think what's an interesting wrinkle here, and I think you were kind of getting at this with the question too, is like, is there a way to be most efficient, right? Like, is there a time when you can like most get at someone? And I'll tell you the truth, this is something I asked to a lot of sports psychologists. It's a question I even asked to Shane Battier when he was, because he's like a big data and stats guy, analytics. And at the time he was, I forget his exact title, but he was like, vice president of data and analytics for the Miami Heat. And I asked him, I said, have you thought about doing any, sort of like statistical studies about like when might be the best time to talk shit during a competition, right? Like when might it be most effective? Because it's like you are presenting this mental challenge, which can be incredibly taxing, on a person. Brian Decker, who's a former Green Beret who now does player development in the NFL, he told me that the best way to stress someone out physically is to stress them out mentally. Right? That is the best way to stress someone out. So you're adding this challenge, this cognitive challenge, on top of like the load of stress that they're already under just over the course of a game. And like, so is there a time when like, middle of the third quarter, you're sort of like, you're feeling most tired. You're a little bit, your legs are tired. You're waiting for the coach to sub you out for a few minutes, whatever. And he paused and he said, I've thought about it. I said, well, can you tell me what you found? Like, what are you like? And he's like, I can't talk about it because it's been deemed to be unethical, but I'm not giving up on the idea yet. So
I had to give you hope.
Yeah. So, I mean, but the point is that like, there really is an art and science to it in that way.
Right.
Right. Because like, so I'll give you another example. Okay. So in the sport of cricket, you would probably never think that there's a lot of trash talk in cricket, right?
I wouldn't know.
You would, right? It's like white sweaters and breaks for tea.
Right.
That's cricket. There is so much trash talk in cricket. They call it sledging. Okay. And the reason for it is because cricket is a game that requires intense and unrelenting mental stamina, right? It's a batsman could be at bat for hours or days at a time. And a single mistake could end their turn and like really do damage to their team. So you need to be so laser focused. So of course, the whole other team is trying to get under your skin. They're trying to distract you. They're trying to do anything they can to intimidate you, whatever, to do anything they can to make you think about this little ball that's flying at you at 100 miles an hour, right? So there's a ton of it in cricket. And I spoke to this guy named Mo Babbitt, who at the time was the head of player development for the English Cricket Board. And we talked about it, and he's like, I've never thought about it, but if you think about it in terms of like the functions of trash talk, one of which is that trash talk can actually increase motivation, right? We think about it, researchers call it a failed mental model. This idea that actually people who talk trash think that the motivation levels of their opponents are going to decrease. But in reality, studies have shown that the targets of trash talk try harder, right? They become more motivated. Which makes sense when you think about it. You're like, of course, it's bulletin board material, right? It's Spike Lee versus Reggie Miller. But in the heat of competition, people don't think about that, right? Like we take it for
emotional.
Granted. Yeah, right. We don't consider the possibility that we're actually doing our opponent a favor, right? That we're actually giving them what they need. We're talking shit to Gary Payton when Gary Payton needs us to do that so that he can lock in. Or Draymond Green, right? The one person who Gary Payton couldn't play well against was John Stockton, because he wouldn't say a word to him, right? And so in cricket, so I was talking to this guy and he said, well, the studies show that in like the seventh over, which is like an inning, in baseball terms, the seventh over is when, the least runs are scored, the fewest runs are scored in the seventh over. So, that would be a time, for example, what we do is we will throw our worst bowler, which is like a pitcher. That's the time we'll put our worst pitcher out there, because they're least likely to do damage against him. On the flip side, that would be exactly the wrong time to talk trash, right? Because you're potentially creating engagement and motivation in a moment when they're really not engaged and motivated, right? So that's a way to think about it too. Is like how like when are the times to create engagement and motivation, and when are the times to not, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like so you have to again consider all the functionalities and then understand how is it going to be, how am I using it in this moment, and how is it being received in this moment.
Yeah, so there's a strategy that you have to when to deploy it, and to think a little bit more about it. So that means that you're giving it credence. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
this is actually something that I'm going to use, and so how am I going to strategically use it? So it's really, knowing your opponent and knowing yourself, right? And how it's
100%.
yeah. I think that's fascinating because you got to you can't just be shooting off at the mouth. And that was one thing about Gary was I think he was very strategic, and he knew a lot. I mean, he was going to talk to anybody, but he
He was
knew
going to talk to anybody. Yeah.
yeah, who was going to talk to. It was really interesting. So last night I was at a function with the Golden State Warriors, and I was talking to Joe Lacob's son, the owner of the Warriors, and he's in player development. And we got into a conversation about Draymond Green. And my wife was there, and she's always like, I've always seen Draymond this certain way, and Kirk was telling us about like how he is so strategic in how he uses his shit talking and his trash talking, and whether it's internally with his own players or with his own teammates, and then how he leads with it.
Yeah.
And it was just a really fascinating conversation. We'll have to, maybe I'll explain it to you a little bit offline, but go into great detail about it. But I was thinking, I'm like, this is perfect. I was telling him too. I was like, I'm getting ready to talk to a guy who wrote a book on trash talk tomorrow morning, so this is so timely. But it's just really knowing yourself, knowing your opponent, knowing your teammates, knowing who it works, and then strategically putting it out there. What so what do you think about like where's the line? I think that's the real kind of most people get caught up in. I think that line changes for different
Yeah.
people. But, where does it go from sharp competitive banter to language that crosses the line into like bigotry or, some of these other things? And then like, who should enforce this?
Yeah.
You can't throw a flag for, I guess they do,
They do.
for that
Sometimes.
talk. Yeah, they throw up tees, but like, who's the arbiter of that?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot in that question. All right. So let's
Yeah.
unpack that. All right. So first of all, from my perspective, there are three necessary conditions that have to be met for something to qualify as trash talk. Right. Okay. We'll go through all three of them. Number one is it has to take place in what the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga refers to as a magic circle. I know you didn't know I was going to
Godfather of
be
trash talk.
quoting Dutch historians, but basically the idea is that a magic circle is a kind of like it's this place that's set apart from the rest of the world, right? It's where different rules apply. It applies to any kind of game, right? Any kind of play space whatsoever, right? This is what allows boxers to punch each other in the face without getting arrested. That's
Right.
a magic circle. It's a safe space to do unsafe things. So
Have
we
fights in hockey.
yeah, it's context, right? It's sort of like it's like the permissive structure that allows it to take place. This context. Number two is I think people need to opt in, at least on some level, right? Like so there's a legal term which is coming to the nuisance, which means like you're volunteering to be here, right? Like you might get hurt, this might be a dangerous space, but you're still choosing to be here. And there can be some discussion or argument about whether athletes or whoever are really volunteering to let other people insult them or make fun of their families.
Right.
But at the very least, right, we can agree that it's like not totally unexpected in this space.
Right. It's in the arena.
It's in the arena. You are in the arena. And then number three is that there needs to be a level playing field, right? So that like if you talk shit, I need to be able to talk back. And
Right.
the reason why this opportunity to respond, whether it's verbally or just as part of the game, is so important is because it brings with it the chance for accountability.
Ah, my favorite word.
Yes. And because without accountability, you're not a trash talker. You're just a bully, right? A
Yeah.
trash talker seeks a response. A bully seeks to silence. So those are the three conditions. But then you get to the question, which is what you just asked, which is like, where is the line? When does it go too far? Right? Because even if all these conditions are met, many people would say, and I would agree, that there is still a point at which something simply stops being trash talk and starts becoming something else, right? Something more dangerous and more malicious. And, the go-to example for me is, the racist abuse that Jackie Robinson endured when he broke the color line.
Right.
Okay, so at the time, nowadays nobody would argue that that should have been acceptable, and yet at the time many people claimed that racism was just another vector for bench jockeying, right? For this kind of mental gamesmanship. The same with Jewish baseball players like Hank Greenberg. The same with Italian baseball players like Joe DiMaggio. I mean, it was prevalent, right? And we can we can question the sincerity of those arguments, but even still, the reason why I think it's important to mention this is that it points to something that we need to acknowledge, which is that there's a problem with the line. Well, as soon as we ask that question, where's the line, we quickly come to the realization that there's a problem with the line. And that problem is twofold. First is that you have the people, the violators, as I like to call them, who will make the case that there's no such thing as the line. No such thing as going too far, right? They'll say the whole point is trying to upset someone, right? So it's like, if you can tell me what's too far, then I'm playing on your terms. And that's not going to work for what I'm trying to do here, right? And then the other problem is that even if we're able to agree that there is a line, at least in theory, we're probably still going to disagree on where that line actually is, right? We might have just a different definition of where the line is. So we're going to cross each other's lines at some point. And which, by the way, this is like not even taking into consideration the fact, the idea of cultural sensitivities and that some things are inherently more upsetting to one group than another. And going back to cricket, another good example is the word bastard. Okay. So in Australia, bastard, super affectionate. In India, super offensive because it has a different kind of cultural connotation.
Sure.
Like being fatherless and being a bastard is like the worst thing you can call someone. So there really isn't a line, right? There is no line. Like, we can never come to a point where we can objectively define the line. But now now we come to two other points, which is what you were asking about in terms of who are the arbiters. But also I think there's sort of external arbiters and internal arbiters, right? And so I'll start with internal arbiters, and that is what we always have, even in the absence of a line, is our own morality, right? Our own moral considerations. Like, what are the things you're willing to say or to let someone else say? What kind of person are you willing to be? Because even if it's like okay to like distract someone with racism, then you're still the kind of person who says racist things. And that's part of who you are. That's part of who you are in terms of the integrity you have as a person. And you carry that with you everywhere you go. Even in a magic circle, you say it in a magic circle, that's still part of who you are. Right? And then, but in terms of so I think we have a responsibility to like our own personal integrities to sort of like uphold those ethical standards. I think we also have a sort of more collective responsibility to not let people say things that we think cause real harm, right? That cause real genuine damage.
Right.
Whether that is like, for example, racism. Like, these guys were not just trying to distract an opposing rookie, right? They were also leveraging outside systems of power and oppression that had material consequence on the lives of black folks in America, right? That is what they were doing. It's like, can we not agree that that's too far, right? That someone in a powerless position being like, that leveraging that against them is somehow like beyond the pale of what we're willing to be, who we're willing to be, and what we're willing to say. So, but the interesting thing, the last point I'll make on this is that I think the reality is, right, so we have players who can sort of, draw the line for themselves, and they do so, to be honest, quite well, right? Within the context of locker rooms and that kind of thing, there are sort of norms and codes that are enforced, and rookies quickly come to understand them. I asked a football player named Chris Cluey, when does someone cross the line? He's like, when someone throws a chair. Like,
but it turns into wrestling.
Yeah, he's like, that's when the line's crossed, right? Like, that's like, and you sort of like you figure that out with each other. But the people I wanted to most talk to about this were referees, because like to your point about calling a technical or throwing a flag, they're the ones who actually have the kind of institutional power,
right,
to draw the line. And so what they would say, almost across the board, is what they look for in terms of when something is going too far is not necessarily what is said. I mean, there are those special words that someone can say that, like, are
and no
matter what. Yeah.
Right. Like in baseball, right? Where they're just
although to be honest, a lot, the NBA referees I spoke to would say you hear a lot of those words and you don't actually throw them because Here's because it doesn't actually trigger a response, right? Because it's like if it's a couple of a couple of guys, if it's look like a racial slur, right? Well, almost always, or in theory, should get a flag. But if it's a couple of guys who are both black and one of them says a racial slur to the other, it's like, are they going to throw? Are they going to tee that
Right.
up? Like,
Right.
According to the guys I spoke to, they said they've never done that. It's never happened. But what they look for is the response, right? It's not really about what's said. The power is all in the response, or the power to define the character of the trash talk is really comes from the response. How is it received, right? And so this goes back to that idea again that it's like it's this challenge, and it's all about, am I going to respond in the right way? Do I understand the challenge being presented for what it really is? It's the response that defines the character of the trash talk itself. Because if I respond by getting upset, I'm escalating, right?
Yeah.
And then they have to step in. But if you say something super offensive to me and I brush it off, they're not going to flag it. So it's like, was it offensive or not? Right?
Right.
You could say the same thing to two different people, and the only difference is how someone responds. And that's the thing that defines the quality of the trash talk or not.
I love that answer. So I'm going to try to weave this back in here, but we talk about the '90s and the NBA and the moral panic, of during that time. This is kind of where it really started to hit. It's starting to be used. People are trying to draw these lines. Talk to me more about that. Like, did that shape today's norms? Do you think?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so basically, the term trash talk is kind of a new invention, right? We were saying at the outset of this, right, that this is a deeply ingrained human behavioral phenomenon that has existed across time and geography, culture, et cetera, right? So it's there's nothing abnormal about talking trash. However, the term itself, trash talk, was really only invented in the early 1980s, right? It was coined around 1981 when it first appeared in print in the Washington Post. And then it was popularized over the next decade or so by America's largely white contingent of sports editors, right? And effectively, they invented the term to describe what they saw as like a new, more aggressive behavior. And the reason that they saw it as new and more aggressive is because this was a different form of trash talk, had a different flavor than what we would have seen in like baseball and bench jockeying, which existed forever, right? There are lots of stories in the media about bench jockeying, so we knew what it was. But at the same time, trash talk, we didn't make those connections because we saw it coming from like a specific culture within the U.S. that felt very foreign to a lot of people, and by a lot of people I mean specifically white people. And so we defined it as something different, as something new. That's when we started to also define it as something deviant, as something that was unsportsmanlike. It felt aggressive. It felt like it was being, it was uncontrolled behavior that we needed to impose some kind of control on. And so very quickly, right, in the early 1990s, I actually tracked this. I did I looked for all the mentions of literally the term trash talk in newspapers and magazines across the country, starting from 1980 on. And so you find one mention in 1981, you find a couple sprinkled over the next couple of years. There might have not been another one until 84. Then you start in the early 90s to get like a couple hundred. And then in 1993, there's an explosion of the term trash talk. In fact, there's a story in the New York Times Magazine that has a quote to the effect that's like 1993 is destined to be known as the year of trash talk, right? Because it became this phenomenon.
Right.
It became this thing that everyone became obsessed with, right? We were describing it as this brand new thing. And to a certain extent it was because, it grew out of those cultures like hip hop and playground basketball and even more long-standing black oral traditions like the dozens. And these were things that a lot of people didn't have familiarity with. So there was something new to it. But was missing from those conversations was the ways in which this is still something that's, sort of just like instinctively human, something that's like part of all of us, part of how it's the language of competition. It has always been the language of competition. And so because those connective threads were left out of the conversation, it sort of became stigmatized and it became racialized. And that's where the moral panic comes from. Like, this is something that's unsportsmanlike. This is, you're showboating. You're showing people up. You're being rude. You're not being sportsmanlike. And so very quickly on the heels of this explosion of stories, you start to get the blowback, right? You get the backlash, and that comes in the form of just punditry and people saying we need to get this out of our game, but also comes in the form of policy, right? Like policy within leagues in terms of what they're trying to police out of their games. And once it gets framed in that way, then we start to see players like Gary Payton as being unsportsmanlike, because now that we've defined it as unsportsmanlike.
Right.
There's nothing inherently unsportsmanlike about it. It's just our definition of sportsmanship,
Right.
right? Like sportsmanship is culturally relative. It's however we define it. And this is how we defined it, and we defined it from like a specific cultural perspective. And so basically our idea of trash talk comes out of the invention of that term, which was built around this idea that this was something new, which was not true. And specifically as something that largely black people were doing. And so I think that's part of the reason why we haven't engaged with it sort of culturally and societally, is because we've just immediately written it off as this thing that is bad, this thing that is wrong to do, this thing that is unsportsmanlike. But by doing that, we also misunderstand everything we've been talking about up till this point. So you're exactly right that like starting in the 80s, but specifically even more so in the 90s, when we kind of started grappling with it culturally, we laid the foundation for how we still think about and talk about trash talk today.
Yeah, I love that. So this is the next thing. I've found this super interesting, and I couldn't wait to get your perspective on this. I've become, so I'm a girl dad, so I have athletes, yeah, and so I've become more ingrained into women's athletics and the appreciations for it and things like that. And I think women's basketball right now is in a golden era of it, and so we're Golden State Valkyries, season ticket holders. We've been to some games here, and there was this period here where Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark were sometimes one-sided, engaged in some trash talking. But what I found interesting was it's a part of the game so much that it's now being done by the women in basketball, and it's being looked at differently, and that was interesting to me. Is kind of like, how do you see that? What kind of patterns do you notice in women's sports? The frequency, the style, kind of the public reaction around it.
Yeah. Especially the public reaction, I think, is what's interesting to think
Right.
about. But it's, I will say this is something that I thought about quite a lot while I was reporting, and it's a question that I put to a lot of different people, both athletes, male and female, as well as different psychologists and performance experts, that kind of thing. And I think the best way that I came to think about it is that trash talk isn't an inherently male or female, behavior, but it can become very quickly socialized, by how we, the ways that we think about, acceptable forms of aggression,
Right.
within male, within female, and that's defined by society and culture and these kinds of things, right? So like when we see someone talking trash, it might be defined, it might be seen negatively from some people, right, and not negatively from others. We saw this very clearly in, racially, right, when we think about a player like Larry Bird and how he was looked at, and one of the all-time great trash talkers. But never was it suggested that Larry Bird was somehow unsportsmanlike. He's always a gamer. He's always, just uber competitive, all these kinds of things. Whereas, someone like Gary Payton, his reputation was so damaged by trash talk that he was initially held off of the 1996 Olympic team. To quote Sports Illustrated, because they were scared of an international incident,
Gary's going to touch off nuclear strikes.
But it's like these guys are doing the same thing, but we see it very differently.
Right.
And so it's socialized in different ways.
Yeah.
Within women's sports, and I think the example of Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is a good one too, because it's like the way we think about Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese is a lot of the same way we thought about Larry Bird versus Gary Payton.
That's the way I thought.
Yeah, and it's also being compounded by the fact that they are both women too. And so like we're sort of it's sort of forcing us, to grapple with this behavior in a different context, and it's also sort of like dredging up these deeply held, beliefs, or biases that we may not even realize that we have about who's allowed to do what and how we interpret it, right? Oftentimes our response, like in the same way that a response to the response to trash talk kind of defines the quality of it, the response to other people trash talking actually reveals more about ourselves than it does the people who are doing the trash talk, right? I mean, Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are doing the same damn thing, but we have very different responses to it, and that says more about us than it says about them.
I agree, 100%. I think the WNBA is really pushing some uncomfortable boundaries in our culture right now, just based on the popularity of where it's going and what they're doing. And I can't think of a larger, better professional women's sports league than the WNBA and what they're doing. So it's something we'll have to pay more attention to and see how that plays out. But really, how do you think, get more modern style now, how do you think social media has changed trash talk? From in-game whispers to global stagecraft, there's a lot more stuff that can kind of get infiltrated into people. We used to have to speak through the media before, bulletin board material, things like that. But now with social media, it's kind of like ubiquitous.
Yeah. I mean, social media is such a big, and, omnipresent, force in our world these days. I think it has an effect in a lot of different ways, right? Just to break down a couple of them, I would say one is that now people can use the marketing vehicle of social media to promote themselves, to promote their own brands via trash talk in the way that a Muhammad Ali would do in putting down Joe Frazier before a fight.
Right.
You just look at like Wendy's Twitter account or all these brands that understand the marketing aspects of it, that like we can draw attention by creating beef, by creating rivalry, right? So that's one form of it. Another is that I actually think, people can talk a lot of crap, without the accountability, thanks to social media, right? Like you can say a lot of shit, and then you get in the game, and you might not say anything, right? And so it's like you can be a dog with a big bark, on social media. And as we see, just like with all the toxicity online, it's like very rarely do you actually have those moments of real accountability. I mean, I would say an athlete has more of that, but I spoke to people who would say, "Oh, I was watching this, back and forth between these two guys, on social media, and I couldn't wait, to see them in the game, broadcasters, people who are on the sidelines, and then the game happens, and they don't say a word to each other, right? So it's all performative in some ways. It's all for a lot of people. I wouldn't say everyone. It's almost all marketing, but that's not the extent of it. So social media also. Let's think about Kevin Durant, right? The guy with 1 million burner accounts and this and that. It's like, why is he doing that? Like he's obviously like, finds some benefit to it. And I think, if you think about it, someone like a Michael Jordan, who's always looking for, that extra ounce of motivation, that little bit of slight, even inventing a story that someone else might not have, said something to give themselves that engagement for a game. Social media is a perfect place to find, 1 million little trolls or slights, etc. It's an endless well of exactly these kinds of things. But on the flip side, for a lot of people, that can be really dangerous because now you might be thinking about and worrying about other people's opinions and what they think about you. And now when you're in the game, if you're worried about what people are going to say about you on social media after the game, you're going to mess up, right? You're not focusing on the task at hand. You're distracted. You're not controlling the controllables. All these like basic tenets of mental toughness, you're not focused on because you're too worried about what someone else thinks, right? So social media also plays a big role in that way because we can't help it, right? When you're online, you can't help but think about like, well, are people going to like my post or not? Is someone talking crap about me or not? Right. I mean, well, you can help it, actually. It's quite easy to, I mean, like, not quite easy, but like the antidote is don't worry about what people say about you. Like, you can't control what people say about you. That is not your concern. It is not something that that you have agency over, at least beyond just like being the best person that you can be and or the best performer that you can be and let the chips fall where they may. But technology and in general, I think has changed it in that sense. But also, it's changed it in the sense that it's kind of intruded on the games too, right? Like now we can capture these moments, like within sport, there's mics everywhere. Everyone has an iPhone. Everyone can become their own like personal reporter and blast it out to a million people on social media, Twitter, whatever. And so you can capture more moments of these back and forth. So we're actually, the things that are said, like because of the scale and speed of technology, can just go everywhere instantly.
Right.
Whereas like even Muhammad Ali, like at the peak of his powers in a press conference with Joe Frazier, it was still limited to like who's going to read that newspaper, who's turning on the TV that night. Now it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's a blowhorn now.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's become so amplified to, like you just said, the trash talk was controlled and filtered through the media, and we heard what they decided for us to hear. Mm-hmm. And now everybody that's a large portion of why we're in the problems we are in our country right now. Is that, everybody's voice is so amplified. Normally it would be just in your little house and maybe your people around you, but now your opinions are like gone. Worldwide.
And we've completely removed the context from it, right?
And the accountability.
But we've removed the context in the sense, now it doesn't exist just in the magic circle anymore. Right. It no longer has the permissive structure. Now we're just experiencing incivility for incivility's sake. We're not really understanding it as competitive incivility. Right? Because it's the competition. It's the idea that we're actually giving each other like a noble challenge. We're pushing each other to be better, to get to our very best. That kind of is what gives the moral center, right? Gives us the excuse to do this to each other. Because we're not actually trying to hurt each other. We're trying to get better, and we're trying to push each other to be better. But now we're taking it out of that context entirely.
Yeah, and so this is kind of going to transition to my next part is because a lot of people or other people, they don't play sports anymore, or so where are they trash talking in their current life? How does this translate to the boardroom? How does this translate to business? I think that's an interesting part for me to hear from you, and I'm sure other people are listening to this. Is how is trash talking? Is it a broad, like we've talked about, it's a broader human behavior, but like how does it translate?
Yeah. I would say trash talk it may or may not translate itself explicitly in terms of trash talk. Right. I think it very much can, right? There are some very clear benefits or functions of trash talk within groups, right? In group settings. One is it can create a sense of more belonging, right? When you talk crap about an outside group, or you expose people to trash talk from an outside group about your group, it creates a deeper and more sense of belonging within the group itself.
Right.
That's bulletin board material, right? Like if your Mercedes and Jaguar comes out with an ad and says Mercedes is crap, and you have an all hands meeting and you say, "Can you believe what they said about us?" That makes people feel more affiliated with your brand, and that's true for people who work there, but also for fans, right? It can also make fans of a brand feel more affiliated with it, which is why some of that marketing trash talk can have some sort of side benefit effect to that end too.
I think Elon's doing it. Mm-hmm. I think he's the king of business, corporate trash talk, I think. Right?
Yeah, maybe without accountability.
Well, yeah, we're definitely without accountability.
So not trash talk.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
It's bullying. But it's so that's one form, right? And then also even within a group, right? Like this idea that when you talk crap with your friends, right? It's not because you don't like each other; it's because you love each other.
Right.
It's a testimony of your own intimacy and your trust for one another. But it needs to be done in a really deliberate way, right? It can be incredibly pro-social, right? This idea of challenging one another, presenting tests and seeing how people respond. And in fact, even maybe helping them through those challenges, helping them get through a difficult and challenging situation so that they can see themselves in a more mentally tough and resilient way. So they can tell themselves a more positive story the next time they get through or they're confronted with something like that. But to create these cultures of challenge within a boardroom or on a team or anywhere, you need to start by building a culture of trust. People need to feel safe, right? For me to fail, for me to push myself to my limits and then beyond, which is where you want people to push themselves, they need to feel that it's safe to do so. They need to be willing to be vulnerable, right? If I'm going to push my limits, I don't know the outcome at the start. Right? If I'm only going to do what's safe, if I'm only going to do what I know I can accomplish, Like that's, I mean, that. Then we're not growing here. We're not challenging ourselves. And trash talk in the sense that it's like, it is this socially facilitative tool to push each other to be better. But it has to start with trust and building that trust and knowing how each person will respond to it. You can't use it as just this sort of like blunt object tool that it'll work the same for everyone, right? It's understanding, and in that sense, it gives us a window onto the principles of mental toughness, on performance and mental toughness.
Yep.
And to me, these are the things that we can really, that we can really absorb within, the boardroom and corporate space, because, we're frankly, we're in like an epidemic of lack of resilience.
I agree.
People feel stressed, and they feel like it's not just that they feel stressed, but they feel like they don't have the ability to deal with the stress. They don't have the ability to handle it. And some of that, and I think some of that what we're doing is we're misunderstanding a deficit in mental toughness for a deficit in mental health, right? We don't we treat every problem, every stress, all this, that like, oh, I feel overwhelmed, I feel challenged, as like, oh, this is a mental health problem. And not to say that it can't be, but I think it's also a mental toughness challenge, that people haven't been given the tools, the literal mental skills, which Trash Talk give us, sort of an opportunity to discuss, to develop those skills, to see challenges as opportunities to succeed and not threats, right? To build self-awareness, to know what I need to succeed and how I can be at my best and when I'm not, and what I can do about it when that's the case, right? To to build the ability to, attentional control. What happens when you are feeling overwhelmed? What tools do you have to deal with that? Can you focus on controlling the controllables, right? Ask yourself what's important now. Deal with it one thing at a time. How can you limit that sense of, basically when we experience stress, sorry to get sciencey again real quick.
No.
Right? But our brains do this kind of quick, assessment, instant assessment. Resources versus demands. Do we have what it takes to succeed? And when we have a moment when we feel overwhelmed, it's this basic equation that we have to start thinking about. How are we going to tip the scales one way or the other? How can we make ourselves feel like we have more resources or give ourselves more resources? Or how can we lower the demands, right? We got a big project on our plate. Feels like it's going to take forever. Maybe it will take forever. Okay, it's not useful to think about that. What do I need to do today? What do I need to do in the next hour, the next 10 minutes, the next 10 seconds? How can I break it down to size so that I'm focusing on what's important now? These kinds of lessons, right? Building habits of resilience, not being afraid to fail. All of these things, these principles of mental toughness, are something that I think are sorely needed within boardrooms, within corporate spaces, because we're dealing with, as a population, this is a little bit like sensitive to say because people can take it the wrong way, but I think we're mentally weaker today than we've ever been. And I'm not excluding myself from that, It's just that we haven't learned how to deal with challenge. We haven't learned how to deal with discomfort, right? This is when assignments start to feel like impositions and accountability starts to feel like an attack. Yeah. Because we're not used to dealing with things being hard. We're not used to doing hard things. And so by understanding Trash Talk and the lessons that it gives us, it's actually an opportunity to become mentally tougher, to become more resilient, right? To build a more resilient workforce on an individual by individual basis.
Yeah, I love that. I think you've hit on it. There's a lack of, we've taken the friction out of everything in life, right? Mm-hmm. And so people, anytime they get hung up, and I see it in my kids, and trying to raise resilient kids in a world in which all the friction is taken out of it is very challenging. You got to kind of manufacture adversity for them in some respects so they can build these skills as they get older. And I think a lot of us as adults, we're naturally want to go the easy route, right? And so it's just so easy to do that now that when you're faced with a challenge, you're not equipped. You're just like, how do I do this? And you push back, and it becomes a bigger issue. And so what I'm hearing from you is kind of Trash Talk is in the boardroom is more internal than it is external.
Yes, I think. For being external, it would only be for, I think, again, those kind of like broader social, like, sort of like tribal belonging, or marketing purposes, but not necessarily in terms of like motivation. The pathways by which trash talk affects performance are anxiety, attention, and motivation. And I don't think you would do it for any of those purposes
No.
externally. Those would be all internal.
Yeah, so when I read this part about it, it hit home because that's kind of what there's a lot of things that we've talked about here that I do as a leader right now in my group and my businesses I build, and a lot of it's virtual. I have people all over the place, so it's been a real leadership challenge to like, how do you get everybody going in the right direction when they're not reporting to the same place every day, hearing how we talk, and developing that thing. And so we have done some things. I'm the king of manufacturing slights and disrespect to motivate myself and to get into the levels I need to do. It's something that it's a coping mechanism, I guess, I've developed over the years that I've carried into my professional career. And we were having this discussion where we were trying to climb the ranks. One of my franchises were trying to climb the ranks, and we've just one day I'll tell this guy about this, but his group kind of became our target. They were in the middle, and internally we have been talking shit to get ourselves to get to where we need to be, and whether it's against each other or against that person who doesn't even know that they're just the target, right? Because we're trying to get to and exceed them. We're finding ways to manufacture that kind of togetherness to all in one place.
Right. And in that sense, it's like, but even though that is theoretically external, you're actually using it internally, right? Because it's like, that's the
bullet. You never know about it, right?
Yeah,
like, and
exactly.
I'm not gonna, it's just something
creating the engagement, creating motivation.
Right. So it's kind of, when I read that, I was like, oh, okay, that's an instinct that I've kind of just gone by way of. So you gave me a little confirmation around it. But I really love how you talked about teammates kind of playfully ribbing each other, and how it can build cohesion, as opposed to, obviously if it's overboard it can drive division, but I think also kind of that sensitivity of being able to kind of give each other a hard time can build cohesion.
Yeah, so it's right. So within a group, so there's this great quote from Zora Neale Hurston. She's describing the dozens, but she calls it a risky pleasure. And I think it's perfect for trash talk too, right? Because it's like, it can cut so many different ways, and it really is all about the response and what happens next versus, the initial moment of trash talk or whatever that is important to the, to whatever that given interaction. But within a team, right? So you want to be able to challenge people. And some of it is like, how are you going to respond? How are we going, are you still going to keep competing? Like when Sam Cassell, got to the NBA, his teammates talked so much crap to him because he talked so much crap. And they were like, this little guy, he's going to talk shit. Like, we're going to dump it on him. And he just kept talking. And he was like, oh, I'm here for this. I'm a competitor. Right. Yeah. And so that is a kind of testing too. It's like, where are you going to fit in? Can I count on you? Are you going to come back at me when I come at you? These kinds of things. Or if that's not in your game, like, you don't have to talk back, but are you just going to keep competing?
Right. How are you going to respond to it?
Yeah. Are you still going to be the competitor you are regardless of what I say or not? So that's one form, is just like this kind of like internal testing, and that's the negotiation, sort of like social hierarchy, but also kind of like teammate relations, like where do we all fit with each other? Frankly, it can also be accountability. Like if someone's not holding up their end, someone's not motivated, you talk shit to that person, right? James Harden, against when he was on the Houston Rockets, he didn't like to practice. So Patrick Beverley would talk crap to him during practice, be like, "Oh, he doesn't got it, man. He can't get up for practice. He can't get it up." And he got him going, right? Yeah. He held him accountable with his trash talk. He motivated him with his trash talk. Sean Avery said the same thing, a hockey pest. He said, I talk crap partly because I always knew I knew there would always be a bullseye on my back, right? So I had to be engaged for every game because everyone was coming for me. So if you're coming for me, I can't take a night off, right? So again, accountability. But what's key within a group is that, because it can be, again, this risky pleasure, is you can potentially, things can go awry, right? Relationships can get hurt. And so when you are doing these kinds of things, there needs to be, just in the same way there needs to be a foundation of trust, there also needs to be repair and reconciliation afterwards, right? There needs to be a handshake and a high five at the end of it and be like, hey, man, that was great today. We really pushed each other. Whatever it is, right? Which is, by the way, something that Kobe Bryant never did, right?
Mhm.
He never gave his teammates that reconciliation. They could either hang or they're not, but he never brought anyone along, right?
Right.
Like Kobe is amazing, but he had his failures as a leader. And
Yep.
right, like 'cause it's like you can be a certain kind of you can be a leader for a certain kind of person, or you can be a leader for everyone.
Yep.
And so these kinds of challenges, right? These violations can be really dangerous within a group. And so the question is, how are you bringing people back together afterwards, right? How are you bringing it back together as a team? Because then the way you look at it after the fact is this was actually again a testament of our intimacy, right?
Right.
It's intimacy masquerading as hostility, right? Where what's happening here is not what it sounds like. But that's always in negotiation. That's always up for debate. It always depends on what happens next.
Yeah, another person, a parallel and to Kobe in the business world is someone like Steve Jobs. Who I thought, he came into, so being out here in the Bay Area, obviously, very popular and whatnot. I mean, worldwide. But when he died, I was going through kind of an internal process of figuring out what type of leader I am, right? And I was seeing a lot of leaders around the area acting like Steve Jobs. Very smart, very intelligent, but really hard to work for, right? And didn't do the reconciliation part,
Yeah.
and that didn't feel authentic to me. So I had to, but it allowed me to understand that that is a form of leadership, but there's all these other forms of leadership.
Yes.
And if you can't, I was, I'm more of an empathetic person, so I had to find my own way with regards to leadership. But the reconciliation part, I think, is the most important, because you can be hard on people, but if you don't come back around, it's the old carrot and stick method, right? You don't come back around and give them some pat on the back.
Right.
You're gonna hang people out to dry, and they're gonna create anger and resentment and things like that can work against you.
And there's also a difference between being hard on people and having high standards, right?
100%.
Right. You can have high standards and be supportive and be like, I know, like, this
Right.
is where you need to get to. But and the other thing I would say is that some of that, you're right, is about you and like knowing yourself as a leader. But also, I've heard discussions, debates about like, do you need to be feared? Right. This is like the
Right.
Steve Jobs things too. Like, and so what's interesting about this is that for motivation to happen, for engagement to happen, you do need some kind of like stimulus, right? This is what
Right.
trash talk is. It's an incitement, it's a provocation, it's a stimulation, it gets you up. But the individual zones of optimal functioning we were talking about earlier, in the same way that it's like anxiety can range from one person to the other, there's also emotional and psychological and spiritual, whatever kind of component you want to add to it. Those also play a role, right? So for some people, fear might be the thing that really activates them and gets them going. For other people, fear might be the thing that shuts them down.
Right.
Right. So how are you not just thinking about like, who am I as a leader, but how, again, is each individual, like reacting to this? And am I sort of activating each of my people, giving them what they need to get to their best? Right.
Right.
And that can be different from one person to the next. And the other thing I would say is that fear, I saw that fear, right, is like fear can be really good in like short-term bursts, right? It's like highly activating in the moment, high focus, but like over the course of a longer term, that could be, I mean, you're looking at burnout, you're looking at
Yeah.
more of a toxic environment, all those kinds of things. But again, I would even with that in mind, say that could still vary from one person to the next, because the thing that's activating for one person could be the thing that actually gets the other person to shut down.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good stuff. What was the toughest interview of all these people that you talked to or moment in the book to nail down?
Well, so yeah, there's a couple ways to slice it. One, the hardest interview to get, we talked about this the other day, was Gary Payton, just chasing him around the country.
Right.
Because, he was kind of my white whale, the guy I knew I had to talk to. And so he was coaching for the Big Three tournament at the time. And so I was literally in Vegas, I was in Vegas for the McGregor-Poirier fight, but I still was, taking advantage of that time to hang out with the Big Three folks. And just circling around him the whole time doesn't happen. Just going to chase him to I think it was in New Orleans or Dallas. There was going to be another Big Three event like a couple weeks later, And then at the last minute, I end up calling the guy who's organizing it, who's my liaison. And I'm like, all right, just confirming that like you've talked to Gary Payton and like we're on. And he's like, oh, we're not in New Orleans anymore. There's a hurricane coming or whatever. He's like, we're gonna be in Milwaukee. You got to fly to Chicago. And I'm just like scrambling to get around the country, chasing him down. And eventually we do talk, and he's awesome. But talking to him was super easy, and we had an amazing conversation. But like literally, the act of chasing him down, that was the hardest.
That's awesome. Yeah, the one you want always makes it the harder, makes you want it more, right?
Yeah.
So, what about which Legends approach would you say best encapsulates, the art of trash talk? I mean, obviously Gary, but what's their kind of repeatable technique, of all these people you talk to that I think was the best kind of?
So there is no repeatable technique because it all has to start with self-awareness, right? Like it's all individual. The effects of trash talk are not uniform from one person to the next or one situation to the next. So the key is understanding how are each of these various pathways going to affect me individually. I think someone like Muhammad Ali is interesting in that regard because he made use of all of these different functions. And so in that sense, he kind of creates a model along all these different lines. But the way he used it may not be the right way for other people, right? He needed the accountability. He needed, to get up. There's a reason why he invited so many people and reporters and photographers to his training camp, right? Because he needed to feel that pressure. Right? Because otherwise he wasn't going to get up for it. If he didn't get up for it, he wasn't going to train. If he didn't train, he wasn't going to be ready for the fight. If he wasn't ready for the fight, he wasn't going to win. And so, so it's all about how can I use trash talk is a tool. And so the question is, how can I best apply this tool for myself?
Got it. All right. Well, we could go on I got 100 million other questions here, but I'll save us for time here. But I got one other question. So I ask all my guests this to kind of, finish this sentence. And we've talked a lot about how trash talk relates to grit, mental toughness, and whatnot. But I want you to finish this. All grit, no quit means what to you?
Willpower. And I would say that because, all right, I gave my one word, but I'll explain it briefly, which is that so there's I was talking to a sports psychologist who told me about this formula that an old track coach of his used to use, which is success equals talent times preparation times effort times will, right? And this idea is if you think about it like a science beaker, right? The size of the beaker is your talent, right? Or we could have different size beakers, but then there's two other questions. One is how much are you going to put into the beaker, right? And that's preparation, that's practice. To quote my friend Mark Aoyagi, the sports psychologist, it's where you turn capability into ability. Then there's the question of how much are you going to get out of that beaker, right? And that's defined by effort, how much you're putting out there, and then will, right? So that's when you get to that moment when you're not sure you can go on anymore. Right, you reach that pain threshold, or that stress threshold. If sometimes it might not be physical, pain or stress, but that moment where it feels like I just don't have what it takes. When you need to scrape the very last drops out of the bottom of that beaker, right? When it feels like you can't go on, when it would be super easy to just pull up and be like, my hamstring hurts, I'm not going to make it. When you push through that, that's the willpower, and that's grit. And there's two things that as I've come to think of it that help define that willpower. One is purpose. It's knowing why you're doing something, right? You're going to get to that finish line. If someone says to you, like your kids are standing on the other side of that finish line, and even though it's like this is the most excruciating pain you've ever been in your life running right now, you're going to get to that finish line if you know that getting there is going to ensure their health and happiness for the rest of their life, having that purpose. But the other is preparation. It's practice, which is essentially preparation. So purpose and practice. And I say practice, it's building these habits of resilience, right? Having these moments to when you get distracted, to refocus, to when you're feeling overwhelmed, to pressing on anyway. And by doing this on a daily basis, finding ways to build daily habits of resilience. So when you find yourself in that moment, you press on, you demonstrate willpower without even thinking about it. Because that's the behavior you've trained yourself to do, right? Great quote from the Greek poet Archilochus. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure your listeners have, right? We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. So how have we practiced for this moment? Because when we reach that moment of willpower, that when we need to press through, when we think of us grit, what's the thing that's going to carry us through that moment? Purpose or practice?
Love it. All right, we're gonna finish on that. Great stuff, Rafi. How can people reach, or how can people follow you, reach out to you? What are the best channels you're on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm on on LinkedIn. Connect on LinkedIn. Follow me on Instagram. Also, I'm on Substack. Recently launched newsletter. Still very early days. RafiCohan.substack.com. Would love to have more people on the list.
Yeah, man, I recommend the newsletter. I follow it. I love it. Every time it pops up, it's very thoughtful, and I like to kind of see what you got to say about certain things at the time, and it's very timely about what's going on in the world and at the moment, or certain stuff. But yeah, man, all the best. Thank you so much for coming on again. I got the book right here. I'll be giving away a few copies. There'll be a link in the bio. Or wherever.
And leave reviews on Amazon, please.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to go on and get mine on there for sure. But yeah, man, thank you again for coming on. And I just really appreciate you bringing this perspective to grit, because I just think it's, underestimated, not thought about, and reviled in a lot of ways. And it really is something that can really push you through. So thanks again, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care, bud.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and tell us what you liked. Be sure to subscribe to the show and connect with us on social media as we share more stories of every lesson and every comeback. Until next time.